On April 26, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., a safety test at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant went catastrophically wrong. Reactor number 4 exploded, blasting a plume of radioactive graphite and fuel rods high into the night sky over Ukraine. To the world, this is remembered as the worst nuclear accident in history, a tragedy of radiation sickness, evacuated cities, and a poisoned landscape. We usually tell the Chernobyl story as an environmental disaster or a human health crisis. But there is another story, a story that is rarely told and may be even more consequential. It is the story of money. It is the story of how one explosion did not just crack a reactor vessel, it cracked the financial spine of a superpower. Years later, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, wrote that the Chernobyl meltdown, even more than the launch of perestroika, was perhaps the real cause of the USSR's collapse. Why would he say that? How could a nuclear accident help destroy a political empire? The answer lies in the ledger books of the Kremlin. Chernobyl was not only a tragedy, it was one of the most expensive accidents in human history, an 18 billion ruble fire that erupted at the exact moment the Soviet system could least afford it. To understand the scale of this financial catastrophe, we have to look at the Soviet Union in 1986. On the surface, it was a giant. Underneath, it was a giant with feet of clay. The economy was stagnant. Factories were inefficient. Technology was lagging behind the West. And the one thing keeping the Soviet economy afloat was oil. High global oil prices brought in the hard currency the USSR needed to import grain, feed its people, and fund its military machine. But in 1986, oil prices crashed. Saudi Arabia flooded the market, and the price per barrel plunged from around $30 to near $10. Overnight, the Soviet Union lost a massive share of its export revenue. The treasury was already bleeding, and then Chernobyl exploded. The immediate cost of the disaster was staggering. This was not a local fire. This was a national mobilization on a wartime scale. Within hours, Soviet leaders understood they faced something with no precedent: an exposed reactor core burning in open air, spewing radiation across Europe. To stop it, they could not rely on local firefighters. They would have to use the entire machinery of the Soviet state. First came the aerial assault. Thousands of military helicopters flew sortie after sortie over the burning reactor, dropping sand, lead, and boron into the gaping hole. Each flight was expensive in fuel and equipment, but the real cost was contamination. Radiation levels were so high that helicopters became radioactive after only a few passes. Many were abandoned in vast graveyards of poisoned metal. Then came the evacuation. The city of Pripyat, home to nearly 50,000 people, was emptied in a single afternoon. Buses were requisitioned from all over Ukraine. But you cannot move 50,000 people into a field. They need housing, food, clothes, schools, and jobs. The Soviet state had to build new towns from scratch. Slavutich, the replacement city for plant workers and families, cost hundreds of millions of rubles on its own. Every evacuated family was promised compensation for homes, furniture, and lost property. And this was only the beginning. The exclusion zone, a 30-kilometer radius around the plant, had to be fenced off and guarded indefinitely. Hundreds of villages, factories, and collective farms were abandoned. It was a massive write-off of productive assets. Land that had produced wheat, milk, and meat for Soviet citizens became poisonous overnight. But the biggest cost of all was human labor, the liquidators. To clean up the catastrophe, the USSR drafted over 600,000 men. Soldiers, miners, engineers, construction workers, and specialists from every corner of the empire were sent into the most dangerous workplace on Earth. They shoveled radioactive graphite off rooftops, washed streets, buried contaminated soil, and built the sarcophagus, the massive concrete and steel tomb over Reactor 4. These men had to be paid. And because the work was lethal, they were paid triple or quadruple wages. They were promised lifelong healthcare, early pensions, and priority housing. The bill was not a single payment. It was a long-term liability that would haunt the Soviet welfare budget for decades. In 1986 alone, direct costs were estimated at around 4 billion rubles. By 1989, total costs had swollen above 18 billion rubles. To grasp that scale, 18 billion rubles was roughly comparable to the Soviet defense budget for a year. It was more than the state spent on healthcare for its entire population. This was a hole so large the system could not fill it. And because oil revenue had collapsed, the USSR did not have the cash. They could not raise taxes on a population that was already struggling. So they did the only thing they could do. They printed money. To pay the liquidators, to build the sarcophagus, to construct new cities, to maintain the exclusion zone. The state bank flooded the economy with unbacked rubles. That injection accelerated inflation across a system that was already brittle. Rubles multiplied, but goods did not. Shortages worsened. Prices surged in hidden ways even before they rose openly. Chernobyl was a financial black hole. It sucked in concrete, steel, labor, and money and destroyed them. At a moment when Gorbachev was desperate to modernize Soviet industry, every spare ruble was being thrown into a radioactive pit in Ukraine just to contain the poison. The disaster forced the leadership to stop investing in the future and start paying for the past. It paralyzed perestroika when reform needed oxygen, but the damage was not limited to cleanup costs. Chernobyl shattered the Soviet energy strategy. Before 1986, nuclear power was supposed to be the crown jewel of Soviet modernization. The plan was to build dozens of new RBMK reactors, power domestic industry with nuclear energy, and free up even more oil and gas for export. Chernobyl stopped that plan cold. Safety checks forced temporary shutdowns of other RBMK reactors across the USSR. Construction of new plants was halted. Power shortages spread. Factories in Ukraine and Belarus reduced production because electricity was scarce. Industrial output dipped precisely when the economy needed growth, and the reputation of Soviet technology collapsed. Before Chernobyl, the USSR exported nuclear expertise to allies. After Chernobyl, nobody wanted a Soviet reactor. A high-tech export industry evaporated overnight. Then there was agriculture. The radiation cloud drifted north over Belarus and into Russia, contaminating huge areas of farmland. The Soviet Union already struggled to feed itself and relied on imported grain paid for with oil money. Now, some of its most fertile land was radioactive. Milk from cows in affected regions carried dangerous isotopes. Crops were destroyed, meat had to be dumped or quietly diluted into the food supply to avoid famine. At the same time, the USSR had to import even more food. But with oil prices low, it lacked hard currency, so it borrowed. External debt climbed sharply. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was borrowing from its Cold War rivals just to buy bread because its own fields were contaminated and its treasury was empty. Chernobyl also broke the Soviet planning system itself. The USSR ran on 5-year plans, on promises of control. But you cannot plan for a nuclear explosion. Resources were diverted to Ukraine so massively that supply chains across the empire snapped. A factory in the Urals could not get parts because trucks were reassigned to Chernobyl. A construction site in Siberia stalled because its concrete had been sent to the sarcophagus. Bottlenecks spread like cracks in ice. No central planner could fix them. And as the economy strained, so did the social contract. For decades, Soviet citizens accepted a lack of freedom in exchange for stability and security. Chernobyl broke that deal. The state could not protect its people from invisible radiation. It could not even tell them the truth. In the first days after the explosion, the government lied and concealed the disaster. Children marched in May Day parades in Kyiv, while radioactive dust fell on their heads. When Swedish scientists detected the radiation and forced the truth into the open, Soviet citizens understood something terrifying. Their government would sacrifice them, then deny it. That loss of trust had a financial consequence. If you cannot trust the state to tell you the truth about a nuclear cloud, why would you trust it with your money? People stopped saving. They started hoarding goods. Rubles felt less like currency and more like paper that was about to expire. The velocity of money surged as citizens spent quickly, fueling even more inflation and shortage. By 1989, the consequences became geopolitical. Eastern European satellite states watched Moscow stumble. They saw a Soviet Union that was broke, distracted, and weak. They realized the Kremlin could no longer afford to send in tanks to crush rebellion. Occupying an empire cost money, and Gorbachev did not have it. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989 not because the USSR was militarily defeated, but because it could not pay the rent on its empire anymore. Then came the long half-life of compensation. To recruit and motivate liquidators and calm evacuees, the Soviet government had promised sweeping benefits. In 1990, Parliament codified them in expansive Chernobyl laws. The definition of victim widened dramatically. Suddenly, millions of people in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia qualified for payments and support. The cost was crushing. In Belarus, one of the hardest-hit republics, as much as a fifth of the annual budget was being spent on Chernobyl-related expenses alone. That left little for schools, roads, or industrial investment. Economies stagnated. Poverty deepened, and the poorer people became, the more they demanded help. Moscow was expected to cover the gap, but Moscow was broke, so the printing presses ran hotter. Billions of rubles entered the economy with no goods behind them. Citizens had pockets full of benefits, but shops were empty. The paradox of the Soviet shortage economy reached its peak. You could be a paper millionaire liquidator and still stand 4 hours in line for a carton of milk that might contain strontium-90. This financial strain transformed politics inside the Union. For decades, the Soviet center held the republics together by acting as provider and protector. After Chernobyl, Moscow looked like a poisoner. In Ukraine, the disaster fed nationalist anger. The plant had been built by orders from Moscow. Its electricity fed the Soviet grid. But when it exploded, the radioactive ash fell on Ukrainian soil. The independence movement was galvanized. The first mass protests in Kyiv were not only about language or democracy, they were about survival, ecology, and money. Ukrainians asked why they should keep sending tax revenue to a center that had poisoned them. Chernobyl became a powerful argument for leaving the Union. Meanwhile, the energy crisis worsened. The nuclear freeze meant the USSR had to burn more oil and gas at home to keep lights on and factories running. Every barrel burned domestically was a barrel not sold abroad for hard currency. Export profits shrank further. The budget deficit spiraled. By late 1990, the Soviet state began defaulting on commercial payments to Western suppliers. Ships carrying food waited offshore because captains feared Soviet checks would bounce. The world watched a nuclear superpower slide into insolvency. Gorbachev appealed to the West for massive loans, but Western leaders saw the problem clearly. The system was a leaking bucket. They offered sympathy, but no rescue on the scale he needed. He returned to Moscow humiliated, his authority shredded. Hardliners began plotting the coup that would erupt in August 1991. Yet even the coup plotters misunderstood the crisis. They believed leadership was the problem. But you can arrest a leader. You cannot arrest inflation. You cannot print hard currency. You cannot make radioactive soil clean again. Chernobyl had burned away not only cash, but legitimacy. After the coup collapsed, the Union unraveled fast. On August 24, 1991, Ukraine declared independence. This was the fatal blow. The USSR might have survived without the Baltics, but not without Ukraine, an industrial heartland and breadbasket. Ukrainian leaders did not argue only for democracy. They argued for survival. They said Moscow had turned their land into a radioactive colony and proven incapable of protecting their people's lives. In December 1991, more than 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence. Days later, on December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The red flag came down over the Kremlin. To much of the world, it looked like the end of a political era, but to the accountants, it looked like liquidation. The successor states inherited borders and armies, and also liabilities, and the largest liability on the books was Chernobyl. Russia took on much of the foreign debt, but Ukraine and Belarus were left holding the radioactive burden. Their economies collapsed into hyperinflation and broken supply chains. In that chaos, the victims of Chernobyl suffered first. Generous Soviet promises became worthless paper. Liquidators who had shoveled graphite on the roof and dug tunnels beneath the core found themselves in poverty, their pensions eaten by inflation, their healthcare vanishing as hospitals ran out of medicine. Even the sarcophagus itself became a future bill. The concrete tomb thrown together in 1986 was never designed to last. It cracked, rusted, and leaked. Experts warned that if it collapsed, it could release a new cloud of radioactive dust over Europe. Ukraine could not afford repairs. Russia could not afford repairs. The Soviet economy had been so damaged that the successor states could not even pay to contain their own disaster. They had to beg. An international fund backed by the US, the EU, and other nations spent billions to build the new safe confinement, that giant steel arch now covering Reactor 4. Think about what that means. The USSR, a superpower that once terrified the world, eventually needed a global rescue campaign funded by former enemies just to keep its nuclear ruins from poisoning everyone again. It was the ultimate proof of economic bankruptcy. They could build the reactor. They could not afford the insurance policy. So was Gorbachev right? Did Chernobyl cause the collapse? Chernobyl was not the only cause. The USSR also faced low oil prices, an exhausting war in Afghanistan, internal nationalism, and a decaying command economy. But Chernobyl was the accelerant. It hit the system from a direction it was not designed to defend. It poisoned farmland, forced imports, expanded debt, froze energy strategy, shattered public trust, and detonated the budget at the worst possible moment. The Soviet economy was already a rusting bridge. Chernobyl was the heavy truck that crossed at the exact wrong time and snapped the cables. If the reactor had never exploded, the Union might have limped on longer. Perestroika might have had time to work, but the disaster stripped the state of capital, time, and legitimacy. It forced money printing when tightening was needed. It forced survival spending when investment was required. The legacy of Chernobyl is usually measured in half-lives of radioactive isotopes, but it should also be measured in inflation rates, budget deficits, and shattered GDP graphs. It is a lesson in the fragility of complex systems. Soviet planners believed they could control the atom, the way they believed they could control the economy. They were wrong on both counts. In the end, the Soviet Union did not die with a bang or a whisper. It died with a default. It died because the cost of its own arrogance became too high to pay. Today, the exclusion zone stands as a silent monument to that collapse. The empty apartment blocks of Pripyat are not only the ruins of a city, they are the ruins of an economic system. The rusting Ferris wheel that never turned is a symbol of a future that was promised but never delivered because the money ran out. The radiation was invisible. The red ink in the budget was not. And when the people finally saw the debt, they realized the empire was already dead. The disaster did not create the corpse. It only made the autopsy impossible to ignore. This is Chrono Finance. Subscribe to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.